Hey everyone, welcome back to Adherent Apologetics. As always, brought to you by Youth, your support on patreon.com. Today I'm joined by Dr. Michael Strauss. He's an experimental particle physicist. He's also a professor at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. We're going to be talking about science and its relationship between it and God's existence. Dr. Strauss, thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited for this conversation to talk about how science relates to, say, the beginning of the universe and fine tuning. We'll even talk a little bit about kind of like, is science the only way to understand things and stuff like that. But before we get into that, can you talk a little bit about like who you are and what you do?
Yeah, well, as you said in the introduction, I'm an experimental particle physicist. That means I study the fundamental structure of the universe. What is the universe made of at the most basic level, and how does it all work? So I study things called quarks inside the proton and how they fit together. I'm right now studying this particle that was discovered in 2012 called the Higgs boson. It was predicted by Peter Higgs, and it is a fundamental particle that plays a role in giving mass to other fundamental particles. I do my research at a laboratory near Geneva, Switzerland called CERN, which is the European Laboratory for Particle Physics. So COVID hasn't affected me a lot. All of my research is basically done with video meetings to CERN early in the morning, since it's in the afternoon there, and then on the computer. The way that COVID has really affected me is I usually travel to CERN 4 or 5 times a year, and I haven't been able to do that. And as you said, I'm a professor at the University of Oklahoma, so I teach physics, and that's where I conduct my research on a daily basis.
Right. Before we get into talking about like causal finitism and stuff here, I'm curious, you talked about studying like quarks and what the universe is made of at almost like the most fundamental level. So what is the universe made of? Like, what do you think of when you talk about like the fundamental nature of the universe?
So over the course of the last 50 or 60 years, we've developed something we call the standard model of particle physics. And it basically says that the universe is made of matter particles we call quarks and leptons. So many people have heard of quarks, some haven't, but every proton and neutron is actually made of smaller particles called quarks. And then the other major class of particles are called leptons. And an electron is a lepton. So a proton is not a fundamental particle. It's made of smaller things. But an electron is a fundamental particle. So there's quarks and leptons, and then there are particles we call force particles that hold all that stuff together. Things like gluons that glue the quarks together in the proton, and things called intermediate vector bosons that cause radioactive decay. So from a particle physicist point of view, universe is quarks and leptons, and then there are gauge bosons that kind of hold it all together. Plus the Higgs boson, which is kind of a unique particle in its own right.
Yeah, it sounds like so much fun. But for now, I guess we'll have to kind of hold that off for another time. But it's really cool to see what you're doing with your research. But I'm curious, just to start off before we talk into like some of these specific like arguments and reasons to kind of look at maybe say the existence. What do you see as a scientist, like this as a scientist, the relationship between like, science and empirical and like see them together and like maybe like a little bit of like your story and how you just see it all fitting together and the way God's kind of used you in your life?
Yeah, so I actually, my upbringing, there were 2 things I think that eventually got me interested in science and faith. The first one was that my dad actually was a pastor at a church. And so I grew up hearing stories from the Bible and hearing the standard Christian message. We'll get back to that in a second. And I also grew up in, when I was young, in Huntsville, Alabama, where they built the bottom stage of the Saturn V rocket that took people to the moon. So it was a very progressive southern city in that there were, educated engineers from all over the country who were working hard at getting humans to the moon. And that watching the space exploration in its early days just captivated me as far as the application of science and technology. And so I was always a person who asked the why questions, but I think it was really the space race that got me interested. It's funny, if you talk to a lot of scientists who are about my age and ask them what got them interested in science, the answer is the race to the moon. And so that's probably what started it for me. And then, growing up in a family that taught that things about the Bible and Christianity were true, I've always been a skeptic. So I remember even in high school asking myself, are the things I've been taught about in church really true? And so I didn't just accept them because I was taught them as a child. In fact, you're taught a lot of things you don't accept anymore as a child. I don't believe there's an Easter bunny or a tooth fairy or Santa Claus, but I do believe some other things that I was taught as a child, like don't put your hand on a hot stove because it will burn it. So certain things you're taught as a child have the evidence to back them up, and certain things don't. And so as I became a young adult in high school and college, I really examined these things I was taught and began to ask the question, are the things I was taught as a child, am I going to believe as an adult? And then as I became more and more interested in science and in my education, I majored in physical science at Biola University. For my undergraduate degree, I went to UCLA for my graduate degree in physics. And I began to think, well, if what I believe, is true from my Christian point of view, that there is a God, that he created the universe, and what I'm learning from science is true, then somehow they have to really mesh. And there are a lot of competing ideas about how science and Christianity mesh, even among Christians. And so I began to look at those competing ideas through the lens of both someone who had a strong Christian and biblical background and the lens of someone who had a strong science education. And I found that they actually meshed seamlessly, and that the truths I had been taught in the Bible and that were there actually agreed quite well with the truths that I had been learning and know about in science. And there's some scientists who don't think that's true. They think the biblical stories, like of creation and all, are certainly fairy tales. They don't mesh with science. And there are some Christians who think that the biblical stories don't mesh with science. The Christians think science must be wrong. The science thinks the Bible must be wrong. But I found that actually they mesh quite well. And that's some of the kinds of things we can talk about tonight.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you about two particular areas where it seems like the science and faith mesh very well. The first of them being the idea that the universe had a beginning, that there's a first cause, and if there's a first cause, there's whatever would cause it, which we think is God. So when you look at like the science, for a long time, I think people would believe that the universe was like past infinite. But like, what are some of the scientific reasons that you think you and many other scientists are starting to believe that the universe is in fact finite in the past?
Yeah, so, if you had asked me this question 100 years ago, there was really no evidence as to whether or not the universe had a beginning. But beginning with Hubble's discovery that the universe was expanding, there began to be observational evidence that the universe appeared to have a beginning. So if the universe is expanding and growing bigger now, it must have started to expand at one point. And so eventually, Fred Hoyle came up with the name the Big Bang for this beginning. And the evidence from observations is overwhelming. There isn't a scientist around who studies this who doesn't believe the universe had a Big Bang beginning. But let me clarify that in just a moment. And the reason is because the observational evidence is so clear. The universe is expanding. We can measure also the amount of light elements in the universe, hydrogen and helium, which are predicted by the Big Bang model. And then the cosmic microwave background radiation is leftover heat from this hot Big Bang. And these pieces of evidence are so overwhelming. The theory agrees with the observations to 1 part in 10,000, that everybody believes there's a Big Bang beginning. Now, where you start to get controversy is what the word Big Bang actually means. When it was originally coined, it meant the very origin of the universe. But what we have now understand is that if you extrapolate the timeline back towards the beginning, we probably understand the evolution of the universe from somewhere, you'll get different numbers, but let's just say about 10 to the minus 20th seconds after some origin. And somewhere around 10 to the minus 30th seconds or so from there to the beginning. So what is that? A billionth of a trillionth of a billionth of a second or something like that. That short period of time, we really don't know what happens. So when people say the Big Bang, there are some people who define the Big Bang as like 10 to the minus 34 seconds after the origin, when we start to understand the physics. And there are other people who still define the Big Bang as its original meaning, which is the origin of the universe. So it's funny. Sometimes I will say the Big Bang was the origin of the universe, and I'll have a scientist tell me, no, the Big Bang is 10 to the minus 34 seconds after. And I'll say, it depends, because both terms describe the Big Bang. I once read a Wall Street Journal article that said the Big Bang wasn't the beginning of the universe. Well, that's because the author defined it as 10 to the minus 34 seconds after the origin. And so that's a long answer, but I think it's important, because if you don't define your terms correctly, then you're going to argue. Is the Big Bang the origin or not? Well, if I define the Big Bang as after the origin, then it's not. If I define the Big Bang as what appears to be the origin, then it is. But to be honest, nobody knows what happened in the first 10 to the minus 30th seconds. Now, there's also some theoretical evidence. The Einstein's general theory of relativity, when extrapolated all the way back to the origin, says the universe had a beginning. And there is a theory by three physicists, Bourdais, Guth, and Vilenkin, called the BGV theorem, that actually says any universe that's expanding on average has to have a real beginning. In your words, it can't be infinite in the past. And so what I will say is that all the observations we have from science and all the calculations we have from known science, if you take the known science, the general theory of relativity, the BGV theorem, and extrapolate them back, they all point to the same thing, that the universe actually had a beginning, that it doesn't extrapolate back to an infinite amount of time. And if you ask me, is that 100% certain? The answer is no, because nobody knows what happened in the first 10 to the minus 30th seconds or so. So it's a long answer to a short question, but in science, nothing is sure. Scientists will say we don't prove anything, we only disprove things, because all you have to do is find one contrary of evidence and you've disproved a theory. So all the evidence points to a real beginning. Could we disprove that sometimes? Yes, but scientists tend to go where the evidence leads, and there's not a single scrap of evidence from either known theoretical science that we know is true, extrapolations from things we know is true, or observation that points to anything except an actual beginning.
Right. So this is super interesting to me. So if we think about it, like as a scientist, like you can do this, I can't do this, but you can kind of like look at the models and break it down, and we can look at like the Big Bang in the past, like I believe 14 billion years, give or take, where we can kind of see what's going on with the universe. But then we get to like this billionth of a trillionth of a second after whatever you want to call that originating thing, to where we can kind of know what's going on, and there's just this mystery. So I'm curious, obviously you're a Christian, you think that the reason that there is this universe is because of God. How do we get from this idea of there being this seeming beginning to this beginning being God rather than maybe something else?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So first of all, if this universe had a beginning, then whatever caused this universe can't be part of the universe. That's just sophomore logic. And so immediately you come to something beyond this universe that caused this universe. There are some theories that the universe didn't have a cause, but that's another question we can talk about. So if this universe had a beginning, the cause must be outside of the universe. That is what I will term transcendent. It transcends this universe. Now, what is that transcendent cause? Well, you can start to ask, what are the characteristics of that transcendent cause? And we're going to get into some of those. The universe seems designed, so it seems like the cause has some designer almost. The universe seems to have a purpose, so it means the cause maybe has a purpose. Humans have a personality, but the atoms I'm made of, the matter I'm made of, has no personality. So seems like maybe the cause has a personality. And when you start to look at the evidence, the facts of this universe, this kind of personal, transcendent, whoever started the universe must have the capability of creating a universe this large with this much matter. So that seems to be powerful. And so you start to look at the characteristics of the cause, and you start to look a lot like a God. I mean, matter is impersonal. And one of the big mysteries of the universe is why there is personality from impersonal matter. And so there's a great quote by Robert Jastrow about the beginning of the universe. And he says that scientists have scaled the mountains of ignorance. And when they reach the top, they're greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. So those of us who believe in God have been saying literally for millennia that there is a God who created this universe. Science in the last 100 years comes to the conclusion that there is apparently a beginning, a necessary transcendent cause that the science tells us has characteristics that look a lot like God. Could it be something else? Of course. So this is the other thing I think that is really important. I don't base what I believe on possibilities alone, but more likely on probabilities. I mean, it's possible that you and I are in a matrix and none of this is real. It's possible that I don't exist and you were created 5 minutes ago with a memory, and all of this is just a figment of some memory without any reality behind it. I mean, there's lots of possibilities, but you base your decisions about what you think is true not on possibilities, but what's the best probability. And all of the speculation about what caused the universe at this point are, to me, infinitesimal possibilities, infinitesimally small possibilities. And the most likely probability is what the theologians have been saying all along. And there's other reasons. There's philosophical reasons. We might talk about some of those. Can you have a true something from nothing? Can you have a true infinite regress of causes and things like that? But to me, the God hypothesis fits the evidence better than any other one. And all the other ones, to me, are speculation without any supporting evidence. But the God hypothesis is not just speculation. There is other supporting evidence, historical and sociological and philosophical, that also support that as well as the scientific.
Right, and we're going to get into some of these objections, and we'll hopefully get into another reason to believe that God exists. So what we'll do now is we'll kind of go into some of these objections to like a standard cosmological argument. We will be doing questions at the end, so if you have questions, feel free to put those in. I do want to say, Israel, thank you so much for your super chat. Really appreciate you. You support the show. It means a lot. But let's get into some of these objections. There's a lot of fun stuff here. The first thing I want to talk about is, couldn't there just be an infinite regress? We could talk about how the model breaks down at this like very early time. So, but couldn't there just always have been like another Big Bang before this one, and we have this like so on infinite regress?
Yeah, in fact, that's brought up. There's something called inflation or eternal inflation that would say there's this infinite number, but there's some real problems with it. First of all, the BGB theorem doesn't have any loopholes in any causal universe. So if you can't have an infinite series of regress according to all the laws of physics we know. Now, those laws of physics could be violated in some infinite regress. And then, to me, there's the philosophical problem, and this is something that is debated by philosophers more than scientists. But is there such thing as a physical infinity? Can anything that physically exists really be infinite in the physical world? We're not talking about a spiritual world, which would have different laws of physics. And so there's also real thermodynamic problems. All of the evidence about the entropy of the universe, the second law of thermodynamics, says that even if you want to try to say there was a previous universe, you can't push it back too far. There's a secular theoretical physicist, Sean Carroll, who writes a lot about the beginning of the universe, and he's acknowledged that most of the alternative theories about how the universe began run into this entropy problem that is almost unsolvable. He's in one of his blog posts I read, or one of his talks, he talked about 5 of the major theories about how the universe began. And he shows that from a physics point of view, 4 of them are incapable of doing it because of the entropy problem. And so again, are there other possibilities? Yes, but the problems from a scientific viewpoint, and then maybe even from a philosophical viewpoint, and maybe from a mathematical viewpoint, become really, really challenging. To me, it takes blind faith to believe those things, because you're believing them based on, without any supporting evidence, purely from a materialistic or a philosophical materialistic view. But the God hypothesis, again, I think has lots of other evidence that supports it. So, unlike some maybe Christians who will say, what I believe is 100% certain, I always say I'm a scientist. Nothing I believe is 100% certain. I'm not 100% certain that I'm not in a matrix. I'm not 100% certain I wasn't created 5 minutes ago with memory. But what's the possibility of those? It's really, really, really small. And so I think those other possibilities, including an infinite regress and universe from nothing, whatever you want to say, they don't have scientific evidence to back them up. They're philosophical, they're based on speculation, and they're not, to me, the most probable answer to all the questions that are brought up.
Right, that's great. Another kind of objection I want to throw at you here is, maybe the skeptic will say, okay, I grant you, maybe the universe did have a beginning. In fact, it seems like that's what the science kind of suggests, and we throw the philosophical arguments, and it just seems like there's a beginning. But there's all these other different versions of a universe beginning to exist. We have all these different models that scientists can come up with, and we have Stephen Hawking and the no boundary model, and all these different things we could throw at you. Like, why posit God when he seems like, as a skeptic, you could say we have all these other options for kind of why the universe had a beginning?
Yeah, well, many of those options are an attempt to say there was no beginning. Stephen Hawking's no boundary condition is trying to say there was no beginning, but it doesn't even say that. It really says to me there's no singularity, but you can have a beginning without a singularity. So to me, that's really a poor excuse for a way to get out of the beginning. Again, the BGB theorem doesn't have any loopholes. The loophole of the BGB theorem is the throwaway causality. So now you have no cause for the universe, which is what some scientists actually are moving towards, because they realize that the only way to have a universe without a transcendent creator is to have no cause for it. Well, if I was to come to you as a scientist and say that anything that exists with no cause, you would think I'm crazy. The computer I'm looking at exists with no cause. But when it comes to the universe, the scientist wants to in some sense, throw out materialism whatsoever. Now the universe itself has no cause, which means it's unscientific, right? Science is all about cause and effect. And so in the name of science, they're completely throwing out one of the most fundamental things about science. So when you look at these alternatives, first of all, many of them have intractable problems. Many of them don't solve the problem itself, to be like the no boundary condition. We could go into the details of why it doesn't solve it. Most of them don't solve the entropy problem, as Sean Carroll will admit. And so, and none of them have any scientific supporting evidence. And so, if you choose to accept that as the reason for the universe, an uncaused beginning or whatever, that's your choice. But don't call it scientific. And I wouldn't even don't call it based on any evidence whatsoever. It's simply a conclusion based on a presupposition that everything must have a naturalistic, well, I was going to say cause, but it's not, it's uncaused, so it's not even a naturalistic cause.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is really interesting because we'll get to it in just a few minutes. But I think Graham Oppy is kind of like leading theory on how this works would kind of fit into exactly what you're talking about here. But one more kind of objection I want to bring up that I see a lot more on like the popular level is that say, okay, maybe the universe began to exist, but we have energy or matter that may have just always existed, and the universe kind of the singularity comes out of like pre-existing energy or matter or quantum fluctuations or whatever you have, where you have this pre-existing material that would cause the singularity, which brings the universe, which brings you and me. So how would you respond to like that kind of objection? Maybe there's pre-existing material at the beginning instead of a God.
Yeah. So what that is acknowledging is something has to be eternal. Now,
Mm-hmm.
most physicists I know who would hold on to that would probably, none of them would say energy or matter are eternal.
Mm-hmm.
Most physicists who hold the universe from nothing, like Larry Krauss, would say that the energy of the universe is zero. And so you don't have any energy. The negative gravitational energy cancels the positive matter energy. And so the total energy of the universe is zero. And therefore, you can get zero from zero. You can get nothing from nothing. Very few, I don't know anybody who says energy and matter are eternal. But what they're saying then, if you get a universe with energy and matter from nothing, what they're saying is there are some laws of physics that are eternal. And I think most, there's always exceptions, physicists would agree that something has to be eternal. And now they're going back to the laws of physics eternal. But as was pointed out by Stephen Hawking himself at one point, the laws of physics don't have any creative power. They're descriptive, not prescriptive.
Mm.
I tell you the laws that are going to support the structure of this building I'm sitting in, the laws that support the structure don't cause the building to be there. The laws of physics are descriptive. They don't do anything. And so by making the laws of physics eternal, I'm not creating a universe at all.
Mm-hmm.
I'm describing, in some sense, maybe how a universe came to existence. So again, there's huge problems with this. And by making the laws of physics eternal, you're basically throwing out causality. Again, can I say anything exists without a cause? You would put me in an asylum if I tried to say anything except the universe exists without a cause. And so you're really going to absurd lengths to avoid what seems so clear, that anything that is eternal is different than the material junk we're familiar with, because the material junk we're familiar with is not eternal. And so this leads to a transcendent type of cause with different laws of physics, if you can call it that, or something that again looks a lot like God. Again, one of Sean Carroll's articles, I really like him because I don't agree with him, but he's to me, one of the few opponents of any kind of God beginning who's really thoughtful in his ideas. And he describes basically a universe, that is contingent. It basically has to be there. And when you get all done with it, he's basically describing God. He's not going to call it God. He's going to label it as some materialistic thing. But when you look at the characteristics, it's God. And I'm thinking, you have taken your good brain and your good logic to its conclusion, and you've come to a conclusion that is more or less God, and you're going to try to, say that is something, I don't even know the word natural, when it's not natural in any sense we know of.
Mm-hmm.
It's supernatural in every sense we know it, but he's not going to say that it's God. I can't remember who has the quote, but there's a great quote where somebody is describing this idea, and he ends up saying, "This looks just like God,"
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is great, and we're gonna go it seems like, when we look at these reasons, there's really good reason to think that the universe did begin to exist, and there's something that's maybe necessary, eternal, that kind of causes the universe. And this gets into Graham Oppy's kind of like response to this kind of like argument, a theistic argument, where he says, okay, so we have the theist here that will pose that God is necessary, God causes the universe to exist, and the singularity comes as a product of God. And kind of what Oppy would say is, well, why couldn't I just say that the singularity is necessary? The theist will say that they have a necessary God, I have a necessary singularity. It seems like your theory is adding on God and the singularity, whereas my theory just has the singularity, so it's simpler than the God hypothesis. So this kind of like objection to your view in terms of like what would be necessary, how would you respond to this kind of line of thought?
My response would be that anything necessary is inconsistent with materialism. Right? Materialism is cause and effect. It says that I can study what happens. I can reproduce what happens in the lab. Even if there are 10 to the 500 universes from string theory, I could reproduce that in the lab. But something that's necessary is antithetical to materialism. So again, in the name of materialism, he's proposing a God. What do I mean by supernatural? An entity that is necessary and self-existent, right? There is no such thing within materialism. And so these propositions are not necessarily the Christian God, but they're a deity in some sense by any other name. Maybe it's a pantheistic deity, but it's a deity. It's not anything that fits within materialistic science that we so much love and practice because it works, because it allows us to predict and reproduce those results. And that's because causality works. If I set up an experiment the same way, I'm going to get the same result. And so if anything is self-existent or, necessary, then it's not materialism by any definition of materialism that I know. It's not science by any definition of science I know. It's leaning towards deistic.
Yeah, this is great, and this is what I want to talk to you about the fine tuning argument here for the last for about 15 minutes here, because I think it's a really good complement, because like you can talk about its beginning, but then you look at like the design, especially going into fine tuning, it really kind of shows that it seems like there's a mind behind this. So when we're talking about fine tuning as a physicist, you do a lot of work in the nature of reality. Like, what do you see as merited in like the fine tuning argument?
Yeah, the fine-tuning argument is real. The universe appears fine-tuned. I will plug somebody else's book. By the way, I have a book called The Creator Revealed. I'll plug that. But there's a book called A Fortunate Universe by Luke Barnes and Grant Lewis. Luke Barnes is a Christian. They're both Australian astrophysicists. Grant Lewis is an atheist. And most of the book shows how the universe is fine-tuned. There's no doubt about it. It appears fine-tuned. Grant Lewis says it's fine-tuned because we're one of a near infinite number of universes by string theory or something. And Luke Barnes says we're fine-tuned because God did it. But and one of their great quotes is that fine-tuning is not, I'll paraphrase it because I don't remember exactly, that fine-tuning is not a result of theists trying to oppose God. Fine-tuning is within the scientific literature in peer-reviewed journals. I mean, what is clear is that if you change fundamental parameters of the universe just slightly, the strength of gravity compared to the strength of the electromagnetic force, the mass of the proton relative to the mass of the neutron, if you just change these parameters slightly, we either have no universe or a universe inhospitable to life. And that's fine-tuning. You could have parameters that were required for our existence that had a broad range of possibilities, but they don't. The parameters that are required for our existence have a narrow range of possibilities. And that is supported not by crazy theists, but by the scientific literature. Now, the reason for that can be discussed as Luke Barnes and Grant Lewis do. But the fact that it appears fine-tuned and that there are fundamental parameters of the universe that must lie within extremely narrow range, balanced on a razor's edge, that's a fact of science. And so There are people, again, who try to debate that, and Victor Stenger tried to write a book that said the universe is not fine-tuned. The book failed miserably, and we could talk about that. The universe is fine-tuned. Now, the reason for it can be, discussed. But again, if theists have all long ago says the universe is designed by God to work, in fact, the Bible is full of examples that point to God where the universe just works so wonderfully. Maybe the most obvious solution is the right solution.
Mhm. Yeah, this is great. And one kind of, I think it'd be helpful at this point just to talk, just maybe give a quick example or two of what we're talking about with regards to fine tuning, because I think a lot of people, if they're skeptics, they may think, like, well, our universe has life, but the universe is lifeless. It seems like outside of us. So talking about how these constants actually relate to like the fundamental nature of like the beginning of the universe and such, and like what are these fine tuned constants?
Yeah, so some of the things are if you don't fine tune them, you don't even have a universe. The amount of matter in the universe was fine tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 60th shortly after, in the first fraction of a second. So if you had changed the amount of matter by 1 part in 10 to the 60th, the universe would have either expanded too fast if you took matter away, or contracted too quickly if you added matter, and there wouldn't even be a universe. But the other thing I often hear is, well, you're being very, human-centric, is that you're saying that this universe, if you change anything, life couldn't exist, and you're talking about human life. But I'm not. I'm talking about any life, because what we know is that life requires information. The only way we know to store information in a molecular level is with carbon. It's the only molecule, the only atom that can create long enough molecules to store information. The Horta on Star Trek, which is a silicon-based life form, couldn't be real. On Star Trek, The Next Generation, there's a light-based life form that couldn't be real. And so as soon as you say the only molecule we have in this universe that could support life is carbon, you start to have very, very tight constraints on what kind of environment you could have. And so I'm not being human-centric when I say that Earth is a unique place, and that it's very hard, that the parameters for life are very narrow. I'm just being universe-centric. I'm saying that let's take the universe we have, and the parameters for supporting life are very, very narrow, and that's just the facts. And it's not being human-centric; it's being scientific and looking at what is required for any kind of life in this universe as we see it.
Yeah, this is great. And one kind of objection I want to throw out is like, how could we know these constants could have been different? Obviously, like we only have one universe we can look at. We can only see like our gravitational constant or our strong nuclear force or things along these lines. Like, how do we know these constants could have been different? Couldn't they maybe just be like necessary, or there's really no reason to think they could have been different than they are now?
Yeah, so we don't know. Again, that's always the answer. We don't know. We have evidence, and there are some ideas that in string theory there's a landscape of 10 to the 500 possible universes, depending on how you interpret the landscape, but we wouldn't even know if all those would have different laws of physics or the same laws of physics, or what most people think they would have different laws of physics. So what we do know is that currently there doesn't seem to be any reason why the constants have to be what they are. So we know that now. But let's suppose someday we find some law of physics that forces the constants to be exactly what they need to be for life. Does that take away fine-tuning? If you have a mechanism that does exactly what it's supposed to be to produce an outcome, does that take away fine-tuning? That would be like walking into an auto factory and saying, well, I don't see a single human. I just see robots doing all the welding. So there must be no intelligence behind this, because the robots are just doing what they have to do. The laws of physics tell them to do. I mean, that's crazy. If you have a mechanism behind something that is so finely tuned that it works, the mechanism itself is fine-tuned. And so to me, if we were to find a law of physics that forced the constants to be what they are, life-friendly, then you haven't solved the problem. You've just pushed it back one step. And so the fine tuning is real. And
Mhm.
the mechanism we don't know. Is it random constants that a intelligent designer programmed? Is it 1 of 10 to the 500 universes? Is it forced necessary because of the laws of physics? But all of those things are examples of intelligence behind the process by which we get the life-friendly universe.
Mm. Yeah, this is so great, and I think we'll have one more question here before we go to a little bit of live Q&A. So if you have questions or super chats, feel free to put those in. But fine tuning just so amazing. But one kind of thing I like to talk about anytime I'm talking with anyone who's a scientist is, at least in like the online skeptical community, I see a lot of the idea that we need this like empirical basis for everything that we believe. Like, in science, like things like observations and demonstrations and making predictions and hypotheses and they're all just so important to discovering truth. And then if we look at it with, say, like the God claim that there's a necessary mind that creates the universe, it would seem like the skeptic would say, hey, we don't have any of this empirical evidence that God exists. We can't see that God exists. There's no demonstration. We can't prove it. So we shouldn't believe it. So it seems like it's almost like scientism. So like, how would you respond to this kind of objection? Because obviously you're a scientist who believes in God.
So the first thing I would say is, what do you mean by empirical evidence,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
You mean reproducible evidence in a controlled environment. Well, if that's true, I can't prove to you I had breakfast this morning, because
Mm,
I can't do anything that's in the past in a reproducible way, you know. And so I can't prove to you that my wife loves me, empirically, if you mean the scientific method. So
mm,
what I would say is, I'm a logical skeptic about everything. I need
mm,
evidence for everything I believe. The reason I don't believe in the Easter Bunny anymore is because I don't think there's sufficient evidence for it.
mm,
That evidence comes in lots of forms. The evidence that my wife loves me is not scientific empirical evidence that can be tested in a test tube. You
mm,
know, no historical piece of evidence is truly can follow the scientific method. Now, there is a scientific, you do follow the scientific method in that you make hypotheses about what happened in the past based on knowledge, and you then look for evidence of that. But you can't reproduce it in the laboratory, which, at least in a strict definition of the scientific method, is what it's all about. And
mm,
so, do I believe that you should believe something without evidence? Absolutely not.
mm,
If you believe something without evidence, that's not faith, that's stupidity, right? If
mm,
you get a email from a Nigerian prince asking you to send him $100,000, and you have no evidence that that prince is trustworthy, it's not faith to send him the $100,000, it's stupidity. Now,
mm,
what's the evidence that there is a God? Well, as we've talked about, there's tremendous scientific evidence that this universe had a transcendent cause. There's tremendous scientific evidence that this universe appears designed. There's tremendous historical evidence that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead.
mm,
There's tremendous sociological evidence that says the cause of many of our problems in society are not external, but internal to human nature. These
mm,
are things that point to the ideas that are found in the Bible and the Christian God. Now, therefore, I would say what I believe is based on empirical evidence, the same way that I base all my decisions. When I get in the car and drive to work, there is a possibility that, or when I'm driving home late at night, that the car coming next towards me has a drunk driver and is going to cross the line and hit me, and I'm going to die. But the evidence suggests, and that's not scientific evidence, right?
mm,
Because I can't test that driver. The evidence suggests that most drivers are not going to be that way. So I get in the car and I drive home. And so that's empirical evidence. It's not scientific methodological evidence in the strict scientific method, whatever.
yeah.
But it is empirical evidence. And I would say that's the same thing. The reason I am a Christian as an adult is not because I was taught the tenets of Christianity as a child. It's because the evidence, the empirical evidence
Mm.
from science and sociology and history points to the God of the Bible being real and alive, and Jesus being that incarnation of that God. And that's why I'm a Christian. If you tell me it's based on evidence, I will argue not based on evidence. In fact, I write a blog, and I have a critic who says, it's not based on evidence, and he's wrong.
Mm.
If I don't have evidence for something, I won't believe it. In fact, I've talked about my wife a few times. She hates this. She'll say something, and I'll say, "Well, why do you think that's true? Bring me the evidence." She goes, "Can't you just believe me?" And I say, "I don't believe you. It's that I want to understand why
Yeah.
you believe that." And
Hmm.
so, yes, what I believe in my religious belief is based on empirical evidence. It's based on historical evidence. It's based on philosophical, logical evidence. It's based on what I see in society, so sociological evidence. And yes, it's based on scientific evidence that points to an intelligent, transcendent creator and designer.
Yeah, awesome. Now we're gonna hop to a little bit of Q&A here. So if you have questions, super chats, we'll get through as much as we can in about the next 10 minutes. One from Jesse, which says, how can we see God as the creator in terms of divine simplicity? I was talking with Stephen Nemish, and he talked about how God is not a thing in itself, and wondering how this relates. So do you have any takes on like divine simplicity, or is this kind of something that's kind of like outside of your area when thinking about like the nature of like God?
Well, I guess the divine simplicity question is really one of, who brings it up? Is it Richard Dawkins who brings up the idea that, the first cause has to always be more simple, and God is not the most simple, right?
I think in this, with what I think there's different versions of it, but with Jesse's question is there's this view, it's very prominent, especially in like early church history and Catholic theology, where God has no parts. So like God would be eternally immutable, eternally timeless, things like that. And then he is like identical to himself, like his essence and his existence is the same thing, and things along those lines. So it's a little bit more of like the nature of God kind of is the question.
So what's the term? I guess, I'm not a theologian. What does
Yeah.
divine simplicity actually mean?
It would, I don't have the exact definition of it, but it's kind of like the idea that God has no parts. He's completely simple. It'd be like the classical theist tradition.
So what I would say is God is unlike us. God is
Hmm.
spirit. We don't know what that even means.
Yeah.
Whenever you try to define God in human terms, you are missing the mark. And so, for me, I think it's kind of crazy to speculate on what an eternal, self-existent, spiritual being is like in terms of simplicity or complexity or parts. I mean, I don't know the answer.
Hmm.
If I knew the answer, I would probably be God myself.
Hmm.
And again, the idea that, again, Richard Dawkins, that we get complexity from simplicity, so the first cause has to be most simple. Why? And I understand what he's saying, in the sense that he's saying, well, you can't start out with this self-existent, most complex. And I would say, well, why not? If there is a God,
Hmm.
what rules are you imposing on him based on your understanding of the finite created world universe that we have? And so, again, I'm sorry that I don't totally understand the question, but I just think that when you start to ascribe things to God, and then based on your ascribing those, you run into philosophical problems. Well, maybe the problem isn't
Yeah.
God. Maybe the problem is what you are ascribing to God.
Yeah, thank you for kind of going through that, even though obviously it's a little bit out of your expertise. But another question here from Travis Lee, which says, do you think there's any merit to the holographic universe, the idea that the universe is a 3D projection of 2D information processing?
Yeah, so who knows? We're learning things about the universe all the time. I don't even, I understand what this is saying to some degree, but I don't totally understand it completely. And why don't I understand it completely? Because I live in 3D, right? If you've ever read the book Flatland by Edwin Abbott, you understand that someone who lives in 2D cannot even begin to comprehend 3D. And we can only really comprehend what we can experience. And so I think this is information, right? Because to me, the key word in this question is information processing. Right now, some people want to try to say that we are just a computer simulation because we're based on information. But again, where does information come from in your experience? It comes from a mind. And so what this is telling me, even posing the question like this, is everything we see points to an outside mind. I once saw a YouTube video that one of my blog followers sent me that tried to look at this question and say, well, we are just a computer simulation. But the other way to look at it is, yes, there is an external mind out there. And that's necessary for our universe to exist. And again, that's what theologians have been saying for millennia, that there's an external mind out there, that it's necessary for our universe to exist. So the universe is much stranger than we imagine. Quantum mechanics is much stranger than we imagine. Who knows what some of the, which if any of these speculative ideas will pan out. But here's what I do know. In the years, in the centuries, as science has learned more and more about the universe, the evidence for a God, a deity like the God of the Bible, continues to get stronger with every scientific discovery, not weaker. And even some of those scientific discoveries that people initially think, oh, this is going to remove the need for God, ultimately they don't. And so if I was a betting man, I would bet that even these speculative ideas, if they come true, the multiverse, I could show you why the multiverse might actually increase the case for God rather than decrease it. And so far, every time we discover something new, it's increased the case for God. And if this is true, if this turns out to be true, then I would say that's what it would do. Ultimately, as we understand it, it would increase the case for information, a mind out there processing our universe somehow.
Right. We do have time for one more question from Finding Truth. Santi says, what do you think about the puddle analogy? As Israel mentions, it's the ultimate refutation of our Christian faith. So what is your thoughts on the puddle analogy in regards to fine-tuning?
I don't want to, really criticize anyone, but anyone who brings up the puddle analogy doesn't understand analogies or doesn't understand what the fine-tuning argument is. Here's the puddle analogy, for those who don't know, is it's that, the puddle looking at the hole he's in and saying, the hole is made perfectly for me because I fit into it perfectly, therefore it must be designed. But that's crazy. And here's why. Please don't use it if you're an atheist. Please come up with something that actually makes sense. Because water will fit in any container, but life cannot fit anywhere. And everyone agrees with that. The criteria for life are extremely, extremely narrow. The puddle can fit anywhere. There's no criteria for where a puddle can look. Any puddle that's scientific will look at the surroundings and go, you know what? It doesn't matter what the shape of this is, I'll fit into it. But any scientist who looks at the criteria for life says, you know what? It's really, really hard to get life. If there are 10 to the 500 universes out there, almost none of them have life. The puddle analogy is the worst. I mean, there are good arguments for why you might be an atheist or why you might not believe in fine-tuning. Well, there's not great arguments for why you might not believe in fine-tuning. There's arguments for why it might not be God. But the puddle analogy is one of the worst things I've ever heard to try to describe it, because the analogy stinks. The puddle, a scientific puddle, would really know very quickly that he could fit anywhere. But a scientific life form knows very quickly that it's very, very hard to create a universe for life. And it's not just, I happen to fit in this one. Now, there is the weak anthropic principle, or the selection effect. That is that I'm here, so therefore the universe must be life-friendly. But that's not what the puddle analogy says. The puddle analogy is saying I'm here because it fits me perfectly. And it's just a terrible analogy.
Right. So thank you so much for breaking that down. We are around at the end of our time here, so I do want to say thank you. We have a super chat from Santi Finding Truth that says, thank you. You and Dr. Krauss are awesome. Dr. Krauss, you're not Lawrence Krauss. You're Dr. Michael Strauss. Dr.
People have said we should have a Strauss-Krauss debate sometime. So, okay, we can do that, yes.
That'd be a fun debate. Would you be up for talking with Lawrence Krauss? That'd be pretty fun.
Maybe. There would have to be some ground rules. Lawrence Krauss debate many times. There'd have to be some ground rules.
Yeah, another great scientist. But Dr. Strauss, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been so much fun. You're a lot more awesome than I am, and kind of talking and spending a little bit of time out of your day, even though you could be working in like the groundbreaking nature of reality, just talking with me and everyone else can listen for a little bit. So thank you so much. Is there any kind of like last thoughts you want to share? And just feel free to plug how people can like follow you and stuff.
Yeah, well, thanks, Zach. Yeah, just if you're interested in these kind of conversations, I have written a book. It describes how the biblical account of creation and the origin of the universe we know of the Big Bang fit together nicely. It's called The Creator Revealed. I write a blog, just my name, michaelgstrauss.com, and those are great ways to get in touch with me.
Right. And thank you so much for joining me today. There is a link to Dr. Strauss's website down below, so you can follow his blog and keep in touch. So you can be sure to do that. It's a great blog. And I encourage you, everyone, if you're new to Here in Apologetics, feel free to subscribe. Appreciate your support as we keep on going. And thankful for everyone who tuned in today. Leave a like, leave a review. Thank you to Santi and Israel for super chats. That meant a lot. And if you enjoy the show, you can support us on patreon.com/Here in Apologetics. Right now, we're about 83% funded, so you can join the team there. $1, $2, $3 a month also help. There's also yearly options available, so that is very helpful. Do you have time for one more question very quickly, Dr. Strauss?
I got all the time you want. So,
all right. Well, now we're gonna have 4 more hours of questions after I do that outro.
I have nothing better to do tonight. So let's go.
All right. So we'll do a couple. Even though I just did like the entire outro, there is something that popped up. So I was like, well, we can get this in. Israel Panan has another super chat. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. And he says, can you expand on Sean Carroll's position and your refutation, like a bit more on his objections and how he defends his position? I'm guessing it's referring to like his view of the origin of the universe.
Yeah, so I have to go. It's been a while since I read the article. I have a couple blog posts on it. But he talks about various options for the origin of the universe, and one is God, the God hypothesis, and he just dismisses that outright, basically. And I don't remember all the other. I think he has 5, and the last one is basically that it's necessary, that it's just it's I think his terminology is it's brute force. It just exists because it exists. And again, you can go read the blog post on it, but ultimately, really what he's saying is that this looks like God. And there's no scientific basis. So it's interesting when someone who is thoughtful looks at the alternatives. First of all, the only alternative he doesn't look at with any seriousness is the God hypothesis. So he looks all the other, think about this. This is Sean Carroll. He's really a smart theoretical physicist. And all of these other options that you've brought up tonight, he looks at and he explains why they don't hold water.
Yeah.
His solution is, this is a scientist. His solution is the universe is just brute force. Right? Again, if I was to say anything else was brute force as a scientist, you would say that's blind faith with no evidence. That's really stupid. But when you say it as a scientist, because you've dismissed the God hypothesis and shown that every other naturalistic hypothesis doesn't work, and your only final alternative is brute force, you go, wow, well, that must be the answer. Well, I would say that's not the answer. Maybe you shouldn't quite dismiss the God hypothesis so quickly. And the reason he does, I forget, I'd have to go read the article. It's a trivial objection that any theologian and any scientist who knows anything about what the Christian God is like could easily refute. And again, I think I have 2 blog posts that talk about this. Just go to my blog and type Sean Carroll in the search window. And so, for a scientist of his magnitude to look at all the other options that are brought up by those who don't believe in God and to say they don't work, the only real option is brute force, because I've dismissed God, that should tell you something if you're someone who's really seeking for the truth.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you so much for taking a little bit more time to answer that question, Dr. Strauss. And yeah, I think we're going to hopefully be at the end here, even though I appreciate your time sticking around a little bit longer to have answer that one more question. So thank you so much for your time, Dr. Strauss.
Thank you, Zach. And if you ever want me back, we'll come back and we'll do it again.
For sure. I'm sure we'll be talking at some point in the future. There's so much we could talk about, and it's just so much fun. So thank you again for coming on. I encourage everyone to follow Dr. Strauss on his website. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Israel Santi, Travis Lee, everyone. Have a good